department reached out to me with the request to set up this session just to deal with some questions that have come up. Ryan and Gerard have been also very good advocates for you in terms of questions or things that they've discussed with you as part of the submission process for those of you who've already attempted. So today, what I'm going to present to you is kind of a preparation process flow that I would recommend if I were a research coordinator. The steps that I would follow to getting this through the registration you need through the UCLA Reliance team, and then moving on with your submission to the commercial IRB. We've tried to incorporate questions that we've received or requests for clarifications received, and hopefully we've addressed a lot of questions, but the intent of this session is to allow plenty of time for you to submit your specific questions. So here on this slide, just kind of highlighting the process, talking about identifying a commercial IRB, talking about identifying necessary UCLA approvals in addition to the requirement to register your request to rely, preparing your UCLA specific consent form, creating the actual request to rely in Bruin IRB, and then what do you do in the future when there's protocol amendments and updates and your need to keep that consistent and posted to OnCourt. So just as a brief reminder, the summary of this change is that in anticipation of the FDA proposed rule to harmonize with the common rule, our policy board recommended a single IRB review for UCLA investigators participating in industry-sponsored FDA-regulated clinical trials. Now, we want to make clear that this is not a new big change. This has always been an option for our investigators, but at UCLA, there's just been a slow response to this option. As some of you may know, with the passage of the Cures Act, the federal government put forth a mandate that the testing and evaluation of new clinical drugs, new clinical devices needed to be streamlined with the hopes of minimizing the duplication of efforts and to get that new therapy to the patient as soon as possible. And the Cures Act brought with it many changes, including the revised rule for the common rule and for DHSS funded research. And FDA has also been pushed to follow along and to streamline some of these processes. It's important to note that the ability to rely on an external IRB has always been in place, both under DHSS regulations and FDA regulations. The current FDA regulations specifically state that you are able to rely on an external IRB, that the IRB at your institution doesn't have to be the one to review the protocol, particularly in a multi-site research study. So this will come up again a few slides down, but I just wanted to remind everyone of that regulatory option. For us here at UCLA, we've always had this option, but now we're having this procedural change for impacted studies, and that became effective January 25th. So for those of you who submit in WebRidge, you know that WebRidge now will not allow you to submit a new study if it's industry-sponsored, FDA-regulated, and multi-site. Now, the important thing to know is obviously we for many years have approved these at UCLA, and you have active studies under UCLA IRB approval. There is absolutely no impact to a previously approved study at UCLA. That study will remain under the oversight of the UCLA IRB and will continue to be subject to all our policies and procedures, including continuing review, amendments, and post-approval monitoring. Also, if you have a study that's in process under the UCLA IRB, and it was withdrawn due to lack of response to IRB correspondence, usually because you're waiting for some sort of ancillary committee approval, or perhaps your sponsor's negotiating language in the consent form, and it's taking a few months to get that language finalize. As you know, after 90 days, your study is automatically withdrawn in WebRidge, and it goes into a state withdrawn. When your sponsor is ready to resubmit that study, they've finalized the consent, or you've received MRSC approval or IBC approval, whatever it is that you were waiting on, you can reactivate that study. That study then goes into the state pre-submission, and you have to submit again. So people are very concerned they're not going to be able to finish that processing. And I'm just reassuring you that, yes, we will accept that study. So in WebIRB, while you're blocked currently from submitting a new impacted study, it will not block studies that were in the process before January 25th. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Because I know the withdrawals have been a big question in recent weeks. Okay, so if you have a study you've been working on and you're very close to the finish line and it's withdrawn because you're waiting on a committee or on your sponsor's legal team to finalize that consent form, it will complete the review in WebIRB. UCLA IRB will be the IRB of record. And once you're ready to reactivate, you should have no issue clicking on submit and bypassing the block that's currently on there for brand new studies. Okay, so another point of discussion in terms of selection of commercial IRBs. Most industry sponsors, they have contracts with one or more commercial IRBs, the two largest being Advara and WCG or Western IRB Copernicus Group, excuse me. So the majority of industry sponsors work with these two boards. In addition, we have other agreements with various commercial IRBs, for example, Sterling IRB, Brainy IRB, that we can enter into through our Smart IRB participation. So when you're speaking with your sponsor, when your sponsor reaches out to you and says, we would really like UCLA to be a clinical site in this study, and they're giving you your site startup information, one of the questions you should ask is, who is the commercial IRB or the central IRB that's providing oversight for this study? Now, a question we received recently is, what if the sponsor says, we don't have one, we don't work with commercial IRBs? That's fine. Your sponsor is the party responsible under FDA regulations to ensure that IRB approval is in place. And so what that means is either they can have UCLA be the IRB of record and approve it, or they can have an external IRB approve it, and UCLA would accept a request to rely on that IRB. So even though your sponsor may not have a contract with Advara or WCG or Sterling or Brainy, whatever commercial IRB is available, they can say, UCLA won't review this commercial industry sponsored study. I need you to review it for UCLA, and you be the IRB of record. So there should be no issue with that. Your sponsor under regulation has to provide an IRB approval, and UCLA is saying is we're not going to spend our resources on these types of reviews. So when we put this procedure change in place, we were number one, motivated by the upcoming FDA rule change. And that's in response again to the mandate that the activation of clinical trials be streamlined. That's our number one concern. And we wanted UCLA to remain competitive and to be a site that can be activated quickly. Secondly, another benefit of this change is the fact that we can focus our resources, both your resources as study team members and ours as IRB administration, on studies where UCLA actually has an impact, where they can say, no, we don't like this. We think this wording should be the same, or we think this wording should be different. As you all know, when we're working with industry sponsors, oftentimes the boards will recommend language changes that aren't accepted by the sponsor, and it's a ping pong of this is what the IRB would like, and the sponsor says, no, we think this sentence covers it, and it's back and forth. So we're trying to save not only your time and effort, but as well as the IRB's time and effort, because we have such minimal impact on these industry-sponsored multi-site trials, and we should. because the intent of a multi-site trial is that it's conducted in the same way with the same information provided to the participants at every site. So it doesn't make sense to have 50 to 100 sites revising documents and you have 50 versions of a document. So that is something that definitely we considered and went into that decision. And I have confirmed with Advara and WCG that even if your sponsor has never worked with them, they can still accept a review for UCLA, and your sponsor would pay them instead of paying the fee at UCLA. So I know this was a big question, and the last week we received this a few times. I just want to stop to see if anybody else has any questions or concerns related to that. Okay, and then there was a question in the chat asking, how do we know which IRBs we have agreements with? So obviously Advara and WCG are our biggest ones. We actually have master agreements. We have separate agreements with these groups. But then through Smart IRB, you can actually go to Smart IRB participating institutions, and you can see a list of almost the 1,800 institutions that participate in that initiative. But more easily, when you're in Bruin IRB and you select the dropdown for the name of the external IRB, all the IRBs we have current agreements with and we already have relied on, at least in one instance, will be listed there. And if you're working with one that you can't seem to find there, just reach out to IRB Reliance and we can address that. And then Gerard in the chat put the link, thank you, Gerard, to how you can see which which institutions participate in Smart IRB. Okay, so if there's no more questions, then we'll move on. So again, just reviewing the preferred order or the way this works on a very high level. So the sponsor starts out, they have a new protocol that they're going to run at multiple centers. Each clinical site will be performing the same procedures. So they request approval of a master protocol and consent template from a central IRB, a commercial IRB, it could even be an academic IRB, depending on the sponsor you're working with. So the point of that review is that that master protocol and consent form are approved, and that reviewing IRB considers it against the regulatory requirements for IRB approval. Then each clinical site that's going to participate in that trial, they agree to rely on that approval. And what that means is that we accept that we will conduct that study as approved and detailed by that reviewing IRB. We'll accept their protocol and we'll accept the version of the consent form with some allowable edits for local context or local policy inserts. And that's going to be an important concept to remember as we go through this presentation. So I want you to remember that we're accepting the master protocol and the master consent template. Okay. Then once you agree to do that, then you are going to review that master protocol and you're going to identify who at UCLA locally will need to sign off based on the procedures that are required in the protocol. You're going to be looking for MRSC, IBC, escrow. If your investigator has any kind of conflict of interest or a co-investigator, a family member, you're going to want to identify that. And you're going to be aware of comment and final approval for the initiation of this protocol at UCLA. You want to make that list first, familiarize yourself with the protocol and the required procedures. Then, in addition to receiving the approved protocol from your sponsor that was approved by the reviewing IRB, you're also going to receive a copy of the master consent template. So this is a template that will be used at each site that addresses the regulatory criteria for informed consent. And then what has been agreed upon in our agreement. Hello? Okay. So what has been agreed upon in our master agreement with that consent form is that we can make additional edits to that consent to address California law and UC policies. And we're going to talk about that in detail in a few slides. Once you I understand what ancillary committees have to review. You make your UCLA specific consent form. You have the approval notice from the reviewing IRB, the approved protocol. Then you're going to submit a request to rely to our office via Bruin IRB. So this is the new system, not Web IRB, only Bruin IRB review can be used to review requests to rely. And it's an abbreviated registration form. And basically you're requesting the okay to rely on an external IRB. We're going to look at your submission and we're going to make sure of a few things. We're going to make sure that you're asking to rely on an IRB with whom we have an agreement, either a separate agreement or through the Smart IRB initiative. We're also going to double check and review your protocol to make sure that any of the ancillary committees here at UCLA that serve to protect research participants, that they're identified and that we document that you need their sign off before this study is initiated at UCLA. The third thing we're going to do, we're going to work with you to make sure that the master consent form that was approved has been revised to include the UCLA specific template and required language to meet both California state law and UC policies. We will review that, we'll give you feedback, we'll make suggestions to your consent and get you to the point where you should be all set. We're also going to remind you and enumerate the ancillary committees that need to complete the review before we can give you the final sign off on your request. So we will hold acknowledgement of your request to rely until all other UCLA offices who must comment under policy have completed their review process. Once they approve it, then we will release to you a UCLA specific consent form and an acknowledgement of your request to rely. You're going to need those two documents when you go to Advara or WCG or whatever IRB is serving as your central IRB to request to be activated as a clinical site. And then they'll review that. They will issue you an okay to be activated as a clinical site, and you'll be ready to activate your study at UCLA. Okay, now I'm not going to go obviously over the application process at Advara or WCG because they have different online modules that they use to manage those processes, but we have held workshops on the submission process for each of these organizations. Those workshops will be repeated in February, and those videos will also be added to our online library. So that's the last step and where you would do that. Anything about that? Any questions on this overview or anything else that we've covered up to this point? Okay. So next, with ancillary reviews, this is nothing different from when you submit to UCLA to be the IRB of record. All the OHRPP policies remain the same for Reliance. And this is why we're able to seed out the IRB review and really focus on things where we have questions and comments on. So this is not a complete list. This is an example of our most common ancillary reviews. So you want to understand the circumstances that would prompt for these reviews, that would require these reviews. In Bruin IRB, there are questions that will prompt you to consider whether you need, you need COI review or MRSC, but it's very important that you not just rely on these questions, but that you have a basic understanding of the procedures involved in your study to be able to identify when an ancillary review committee may be necessary. And that's going to be important in getting the study activated as soon as possible. And as we said before, these reviews must be finalized before we will release your final letter that you'll have to submit to the reviewing IRB. So I see some questions. I'm going to open those up real quick. There's some links to the recorded presentations and how can we submit ancillary review applications by IRB number? Once you have your Bruin IRB submission, you'll be assigned an IRB number, and it's all going to be concurrent. So you want to identify, and then once you have that Bruin IRB number, then you can populate that in the regulatory system that your committee is using. All right. Okay, so this is a step where you're going to spend most of your time, where my team spends most of their time, and that is preparing the UCLA specific consent form. Now, when in Reliance, we use the Reliance consent form checklist for reliance on external IRBs. And what's important, so when we were talking about this process and the whole system of Reliance, this checklist identifies for our partners the only edits that will be made to the sponsor approved consent template. And this is something that we're seeing quite a bit of misunderstanding with. So basically, when we enter into agreements with outside IRBs, so an IRB not at UCLA, we say, when we agree to rely on you, we agree to use the consent template that you approve. And the only sections that we'll edit or revise are those identified on this checklist. And so the reviewing IRB looks at that and they say, okay, we can live with that. These are California law requirements, or these are UC policy requirements. We understand, you know, these are non-negotiables, or this is what you have to do. So this is important because I know lots of you work with investigators that really like the UCLA consent template. And what we're seeing is they want to use different sections of our template and insert that into the sponsor approved consent template. And we can't do that. We're going to come back to you and say, you can only insert those sections or that template that's included in the checklist. So even if your PI prefers, you know, the introduction section of our UCLA template, or maybe they've developed a template themselves that they like to use in their consent forms, when you're relying, you don't have that flexibility. Because remember, UCLA is not reviewing and approving that consent form. We're signing off on it for use at UCLA, but we don't have any regulatory authority to approve those changes. So if your PI insists on that, they can, but you're going to have to identify that for the external IRB, and they'll have to approve that deviation from the master template. Let me see, we have some more questions here. So, yeah, so again, more some questions about timing, because most of the systems like MRSC system, where you submit your applications, you do have to have your Bruin IRB number, but that's assigned as soon as you create your submission. Okay. Now, with our template, we actually have various sections, but the one that's absolutely required, and there can be no changes to, is a section detailing subject to injury. This is UC approved, UC-wide approved legal language, and edits to this section are really discouraged, and as far as we have been told, not allowed. That UC, it'll be very rare for them to allow for edits. So this is something that has to be done. We've had some questions in recent weeks about the cost sections, where perhaps sponsor would like to use their cost language versus the recommended cost language in our checklist. And we will accept variations as long as they have the same meaning. So as long as it's clear what procedures will be covered or billed by sponsor, what will be billed to insurance or be the participant's responsibility, we will, OHRPP, our office, will accept these variations. The trick is you also have to make sure that UCLA coverage analysis agrees that sponsor's language is equivalent and acceptable. So we're encouraging you just to talk to coverage analysis and say, sponsor would prefer to use this language rather than the UCLA template. Would coverage analysis be okay with it? And if they email you back saying, looks good, upload that email to your submission so we can see that you've already gone to coverage analysis and they found no concerns. So coverage analysis would be the final word on using sponsors language in the consent form. And if there's any variations there, when you begin your discussions with that group, we recommend that you identify that early on so they can consider your alternate language. The other non-negotiable is that California state law does not allow for HIPAA language to be included in the consent form. So it's very important that all HIPAA language is removed from the consent form. And basically, you want to look at the UCLA separate authorization form, the headers and the kind of information that's collected under that header, and be sure that we're taking it out. This is something that we're doing a lot in the submissions. Most sponsors are including that within the body, including it under the confidentiality section. So I have an example that we kind of morphed together different language that we've been taking out recently that I'm going to show to you here. And the other thing that we're finding is that study teams are misunderstanding the requirement to remove HIPAA language, and they're taking out any description of confidentiality under this section of the consent form. It's okay, and it actually should be in there. There should be some description of confidentiality be in there. It's the HIPAA related language. So what's in that one-page HIPAA form, we don't want to see in the consent form. So I'm going to go into more detail of that in our example, but let me see what questions are coming up in this chat. Yes, and thank you, Gerard. Gerard and Ryan are becoming very adept at identifying HIPAA language in the consent form, and hopefully through this example, you'll see kinds of things that we're talking about. So in the example I'm going to share with you, I have highlighted in blue. Actually, I should have redone this. I'm taking this PI's name off. I've highlighted in blue language that is required by our checklist, and then language that I'm opening up another document, so just 1 second. Language that is acceptable, but not necessarily included in our checklist. So 1 second. Okay, so here in blue, we know our checklist. Shoot. 1 second. So here in blue, this is the language from the UCLA checklist that we're going to ask you to bring into your consent form. Obviously, identifying UCLA as a research site. If the reviewing IRB or another entity requires identification of their name, we would just put it under their name. Obviously, we want to identify our UCLA PI and their contact information. And then I want you to notice as you go through, we don't touch any of these other sections because this consent form is not subject to our approval. So what's in there and the order that it's presented is following what was approved by the reviewing IRB. So we're going to look at specific sections. So like you can see here, this is a discussion of confidentiality. This is under how will your health information be utilized. And there is some discussion of how confidentiality will be protected. They talk about that they're going to code it, that they're going to make it available for future scientific presentations, that they'll be stored indefinitely. That's all okay to leave in there. The criteria, the regulatory criteria for informed consent directs us to discuss how that will be used, and that's appropriate. We don't need to take that out. What was missing from here and this consent that we made up is that they're not talking about future commercial use and possible commercial value of future discoveries, and that the participant won't share in that. So we've put that in there. This oftentimes we try to put in under payment, because when they're thinking about will they be paid, will they benefit financially from the study? But if it's included under confidentiality, that's fine. We're not going to move it to another section. Now, what you're going to see here is basically information that we felt was covered as part of the separately required HIPAA authorization. There's some really good keywords in these examples. So giving permission to use and give out my health information. You also want to do a key search on the word authorize, authorization, disclosure. These are all, we do these keyword search to find these sections in the consent form. And it talks about giving permission to use and give out health information. Another keyword, so authorize, disclosure, revoke. That is an authorization regulatory term. So anything about revoking permission or canceling permission. Again, this is all information that's covered in our separately required HIPAA authorization form. So we take that out, we strike that out, and we'll tell you because it's covered in our separate consent. And you can see, wow, lots of pages where we make no edits, very different from when we're reviewing. Here I've highlighted for Joe Bruin that this probably said Advara or the lead site, in this case, it's Mass General. So we replaced the name of that site with UCLA so that it makes sense. So to our patients, so they say, well, I don't go to Mass General, I go to UCLA. So replacing that. Now here is our payment section. And in this section, you can see that they've also included information about future use. And it repeats our template a little bit. It doesn't cover the California provision, so we left it in, and that's okay. We won't take that out. And then here is cost. So what will you have to pay for it? Completely different from the UCLA template, but it does cover the same points. They're going to pay for study related items and services. They may bill your insurance, and the things they can bill for are routine items and services you would have received even if you weren't taking part in the research. They're responsible for deductibles and co-payments by the insurer for other billed care. So yes, this isn't the UCLA template, but it covers the points that are covered in our template. So this is acceptable to us. As a regulatory coordinator, I would just make sure that coverage analysis is okay with this language and it's not going to cause issue. And they likely will be because it covers it, but they're the finer determiner of that. So in this case, we didn't replace it with UCLA template. We left it as sponsored, drafted it, because it covers the same essential elements. Now, with the injury section, we completely replaced what was there. This is all UCLA template, word per word, formatting per formatting, that's there. And then here, the master template asks to repeat the PI's name and sub-I's and the contact information. Okay with us, it's not a requirement. So in this section, what we would say to you is say, this is not required by UCLA and not part of the UCLA template. It's acceptable, but we'll note on your acknowledgement notice that this insert was not required by our office because it's differing from the sponsor's template. And then, as I said, a lot of times there's references to the authorization on the signature page. So if you did a keyword search on authorization, we automatically will delete any references to that. There'll be a statement about how they've read this consent and authorization form. We'll take that out. And then this is pretty common to have a statement, I authorize the use and disclosure of my health information. That's an authorization statement, and we take that out. So again, for HIPAA, keywords, authorization, disclosure, revoke, those are things we look at. And then anything where, it has bullets on who information will be shared with, or things like that that are included in our separate UCLA HIPAA authorization form. And let's see what we have. So ancillaries. Yes, so all ancillary reviews what must be completed before we'll release your acknowledgement notice, which is something that with the commercial IRBs as part of our agreement, they will not review your submission unless you have an acknowledgement notice. And then this example of this document, I knew you guys were going to ask for it after the meeting. I probably have to go through and de-identify it more because this is not only a sponsor template, it's also a reviewing IRB template. So I'm not sure if I can get it to that point where it's identifiable, but what we can do is maybe in our FAQ, put some tips for identifying authorization language in a consent form, and then you can always come back to the video to watch it. But that's the trouble, that in having a good example, we have to use a real consent, so it makes it tricky. All right, so now continuing on, that's a big part of the submission, probably the biggest piece. Does anybody have any questions about that that I can try to address now? All right. So if not, then we'll go on to being ready to work on Brew and IRB. So in my recommendation, you would have that UCLA specific consent form in good shape, or in good shape as you can get it. And then you're also going to make sure you've downloaded the protocol approved by the external IRB, any consent, assent forms if those are applicable, parental permissions if those are applicable, approved by an external IRB, the external IRB review notice. And when you're looking at that notice, we need you to verify 3 things. We need you to make sure that the title, the formal title, the full title of your request to rely matches the study protocol title on the approval notice issued by the external IRB. The protocol version and date that you're uploading should match that which is noted on the approval notice from the external IRB, as well as the consent version and date, if they've listed that on their approval notice. If they didn't list it, it's fine. If it's there, it needs to match. Also, in regards to uploading the master consent or assent or parental permission, we've had a couple of studies where UCLA is participating, but they are only enrolling adult participants. And maybe the protocol allows for the enrollment of participants from 12 to 75, but UCLA will only enroll adults. So then you guys appropriately take out any parental permission language, you take out the parental permission signature, the adolescent assent signature, and you remove that. But so what you want to do, and we'll get to that point in a couple of slides, where it asks what procedures are being done at UCLA under the external approval, you want to say all procedures, however, UCLA will only enroll adult participants. And that's pretty common. We see that a lot, that we're not, we don't handle pediatric cases for a particular condition here. And so that's fine to do. Okay. And then, of course, you want to have your UCLA specific consent form ready to go. And with that, we now are ready to submit your request to rely in Brew and IRB. And I'm going to go through these quickly because we reviewed these before, I think, when you met with Moore and her team in December. But as you all may know, request to rely can only be submitted in Brew and IRB. You will not use WebIRB for these requests. And you're going to create a new study. Okay, so you go into you log in, you go under create and create new study. And this brings you to the opening page, the basic study information. And as we said, the title of the study, or the full title, should match the approval notice from the external IRB. This short title here is where you can put in your UCLA annotations for how you track your studies at UCLA. And this is what's going to pop up in Brew and IRB anyways, in your dashboard. That'll pop up there. You want to provide a brief description of the study, a nice lay language of what's going to happen here. And then you will always mark multi-site or collaborative research study for these studies, even though we're only requesting approval for UCLA to rely. Question number 5, will an external IRB act as the IRB of record? This is the question that tells us that this is a request to rely, and that's why this application is being completed. So this always has to be yes. For questions 6 and 7, you will follow UCLA policies for identifying an appropriate PI and determining whether a faculty sponsor is necessary. For hem-onc studies, this is pretty rare, but you would review the policy 900 to see if a faculty sponsor may be necessary. You will upload the protocol approved by the reviewing IRB under item number 8. And under item number 9, you'll select the board that would normally review your studies based on your department. So for HEMONC, that's going to be IRB 2. Under basic local site information, this is where you're telling us what component of the protocol is UCLA participating in. In most cases, this will be all. And this would be the section, as I shared before, if UCLA is only enrolling adult subjects, where you would clarify that and say, although the protocol allows 12 to 75, we will only enroll adult participants. Also here, if UCLA is not participating, let's say in the food study or the, quality of life questionnaires, anything that you will not be doing, you would put this here. But in most cases for these types of studies, you will be participating in all. On this page, this is where we identify the external IRB. So going back to the question in the chat, when you click on the pop-up here, it'll show all entities with whom we have a reliance agreement and we relied on in the past. So you just type in the first few letters and the name will come up. You're going to enter the external ID number here. And then for the reason for these industry-sponsored studies, you're just going to indicate industry-sponsored multi-site clinical trial. For funding, it works very much like it does in WebIRB. You're going to identify your funding organization. If it is a federal award, you're going to upload your grant here after you identify it. You're going to identify whether this is a prime award to UCLA, whether there's any differences, and what the status of the funding is. For additional local funding, this is where you would document anything any local UCLA funding to be received to support the study. So for example, a CTSI voucher, that's what you would record here. And then obviously for information on the PI is auto-populated. And then you're going to be asked to include your sub-investigators and other study personnel in the next section. Then you're going to move on to the study scope. For question number 3, we would always mark none of the above for reliance studies. Then question number 5 is a flag for possible MRSC approval. Then you also have question number 6, where you're going to endorse that this meets the NIH definition of clinical trial for HEMONC studies. And these particular studies, the first 4 options will also be selected. We use this also to identify a need for scientific review committee oversight, but ISPRC takes that precedence for HEMONC studies. So this just tells us that we can't release that final notice until we have confirmation of ISPRC approval. We have a question. Okay, we'll get to that. Charles Kendall up. Okay, then you have your ISPRC question there, number 8, the IBC query. And then for local research locations, because the request to rely only covers UCLA, you would always only select the top option. We understand there may be other centers outside of UCLA that will be participating, but you don't need to check those here because our acknowledgement will only be applicable for UCLA. Like in WebBridge, you need to identify the study drugs and provide information on the regulatory status. This is where you would upload your ID. Same thing for devices. And then this is where you're going to do most of your uploads under local site documents. Under item number 1, you're going to upload the UCLA specific consent form. And this is after you've already edited it and put in the required sections, removed HIPAA language, all those fun steps. Under other attachments, you're going to upload the approval notice from the reviewing IRB. Also, if you have any emails from MRSC coverage analysis and ancillary committee where you've already cleared language for the consent or a deviation from the consent form checklist, and they've said looks good, I would upload it here. anything else that you believe would be helpful for the support of our determination on whether this is good to go at UCLA, you could upload here. Important for Reliance studies, we don't review and approve recruitment materials. So if the sponsor submitted recruitment materials to the reviewing IRB and that's what they said will be used, you go with that. We don't require you to upload them and we don't review them separately here. HIPAA, for these Reliance requests, UCLA will remain the privacy board. So if your team intends to review medical records to identify and screen participants before getting them to sign the authorization form for the study, you would select option number 2 under item number 1 here. And then you would check the attestations below to support your request for a waiver. Option 3 will be checked in all cases for these studies because as a clinical trial where you'll be adding to or obtaining information from the medical record, you will always have to have UCLA authorization, use the UCLA separate authorization form. And that is it for the Bruin IRB submission. So any quick questions, Gerard? Is there any questions we can address relating to the population of Bruin IRB? It looks like you've addressed most of the
None
questions.
so far, no.
Okay. Any questions from anyone about Bruin IRB prepping the consent? So at this point, once you submit, it'll be assigned to a member of the Reliance team. They'll do those critical checks that we have an appropriate agreement in place, that we have approval from the reviewing IRB, that the consent form meets UCLA requirements, and ancillary committees that require comment have been identified. And then it waits and it simmers. It just kind of sits there until all the ancillary reviews are completed. And when you receive those, so you may receive correspondence that says, great, we're good to go. We just need to get the final sign off from MRSC, IBC, and ISPRC. MRSC, like in WebBridge, in WebIRB, will automatically update the review status on the homepage of Bruin IRB. So you don't have to upload that. It'll automatically update. But for IBC, ISPRC, you will upload those approvals under item number 3, local study documents. As well as here, this is also where you would load any determination letters from CERC. So any ancillary approvals you would put under item number 3 here, and you would hold your response until you have those in place, because once you get those, then we'll release your notice. And then once you confirm all ancillary reviews are completed, we'll release your notice that says we accept the request to rely. And then we will also finalize the version of the consent that is approved for use at UCLA. And that's what you submit to the commercial IRB to request to activate UCLA as a clinical site. Currently, in our current system, and this may change, we are not stamping the UCLA specific consent form. It's finalized and uploaded under item number 1 here, but it won't have a stamp again because we're not giving IRB approval. That may change to reflect that we reviewed it and we're okay with it. But at the current time, there'll be no stamp on that, but you should still use the version that's uploaded under item number 1. Okay. Do we have questions, Jared?
Yeah, is there a Bruin IRB calendar to reference review dates, deadlines to inform the PI sponsor of expected review dates?
So that's the beauty of Reliance in terms of getting a study activated a little bit easier. We're not reviewing, so this is not going to go to a committee meeting. This review is completed by the Reliance team. We're confirming that UCLA requirements are in place and activated. We may consult with the chair if we have a question or if it's a really unique study and we want to get input from a medical expert in regards to what's included in the consent form or not. But it doesn't have to go to a committee. So these are reviewed as they're received. So I would, once you submit, you would give the Reliance team about 5 business days to get back to you with their initial consult and what they think is missing or what ancillary committees may be required that you didn't identify or edits to the consent form. And then you begin working from there. So the biggest time, of course, is going to be in finalizing all those ancillary reviews, but these are reviewed as they're received and you get feedback. Our goal is within 3 to 5 business days. So that's a plus. Again, because we're not approving it, our IRB is not approving it, we're registering your request and then we're acknowledging that it meets all UCLA requirements. And that's why we don't review amendments except in very specific circumstances, change in PI, change in funding, change to a change that may impact ancillary review requirements, or a change to the UCLA required template language, the injury language. That's something we would have to review. Other than that, you don't submit amendments, and that has different implications. So we're going to talk about that in the next part of the presentation, but we don't review those. And the same thing with PARs. The only PARs we would review are those that result in a suspension, termination, or determination of an unanticipated problem involving risk to subjects or others, serious noncompliance, or continuing noncompliance. And the reviewing IRB makes that determination and issues you a letter, and then we would review in those cases. So when we started talking about maximizing the efficiency of UCLA resources, this is a big thing for Reliance studies, because you won't have to be submitting as many amendments or PARs as you do in those where we are responsible for making those determinations. Okay.
We have another question. If we don't stamp the consent forms, how are the study teams supposed to know when they expire?
Again, another efficiency with Reliance is that we don't require continuing reviews. What your PI will receive is you will receive a request for an annual assurance to assure us that this study is active and that the IRB of record continues to serve and do those reviews. You will still have to do continuing reviews with Advara or WCG, and they'll be sending you emails to get updates to pull together the information they need for continuing review, but you don't have to do a separate one here. So your Reliance consent form won't have an expiration date. If we make a change to add a stamp that we acknowledged it or accepted it, it won't have an expiration date, but that change is not in place yet. And you don't have to submit subsequent updates to that consent form to UCLA. The only time you would submit that would be if there's a change in PI. Anything else, Gerard?
I think that's it.
Okay, so then we'll go, I know that seems a little uneasy for everyone about no amendments and very limited PARs, and as well as it's not no amendments, it's limited amendments, really only impacting UCLA policy and procedure, change in PI, change in funding, change in the required ancillary reviews, or a change in the template language or HIPAA related issues on the study. So when there are protocol amendments, as you all will know, these are very common and very frequent. You would submit, you don't even have to submit to the IRB record. Sponsor submits to Advara or WCG. Advara or WCG then reviews and approves that updated protocol version. If there's updates to the consent form, they review that, and then they release it to you for implementation at UCLA. So we're not involved in that because we're not the IRB of record. However, there's other entities at UCLA that need to make sure that we have the current version of the protocol and consent form on file in order to ensure the ongoing protection and other procedures related to the enrollment of our patients on clinical trials. So UCLA, CTSI, and Health Services have requested that even though you're not required to submit an amendment, that updated protocol and consents be submitted through Bruin IRB to allow for these revised documents to be automatically passed through to Encore. So this is something that in the past was really holding back study teams from taking full advantage of Reliance because you needed a system where the protocol and consents in Bruin IRB mirrored those in Encore. And so we didn't have this capability before. So as part of bringing on this procedural change, we added a new activity to Bruin IRB that's called Update Study Details. And so what this acknowledges that even though an amendment may not be required at UCLA under Reliance, it will allow the study teams to upload protocol updates and informed consent form changes to Bruin IRB to pass them on to Encore so that the most current version of the protocol and consent are always maintained. Okay. This is an administrative activity. It won't be reviewed by Reliance staff at all. And it's really just a tool to allow you to maintain those most current versions. So I'm going to go through this activity. Again, it's very similar in function to the edit study personnel, where you complete it, it's recorded in Bruin IRB, but there's no review time. It's instantaneous. So much easier than submitting an amendment submission, waiting for it to be reviewed, to be scheduled for meeting, because it's already been reviewed. And again, with Reliance, the efficiency is you have one IRB reviewing that protocol amendment and making a decision about required consent form updates. And they say, okay, this is all that needs to be done. And they tell everyone who's running the study to implement that change versus 50 sites doing that independently. So this activity is only available if there's not a pending change on your Reliance submission, which there shouldn't be because there's some limited amendments that you would have to do. But if for some reason you can't see this button, Update Study Details, when you log into WebIRB, there's one of two reasons. One, you're not designated as PI or PI proxy, and you must be designated as PI or PI proxy in order to activate this new activity. Two, if you are a PI proxy and you're still not seeing the button, you need to look under your follow-on submissions tab and make sure there's not a pending personnel change or another update that's pending and wasn't finalized. Okay, and those terms will mean more to you as we go through these slides. So you should, if you're a PI proxy or the PI, you can log in and you'll see Update Study Details. It's going to ask you to summarize the updates. And it's going to ask you, are you updating the protocol, the consent form, or both? You're going to click on continue. Then it's going to ask you to attach the RISE protocol, and there'll be a separate upload for an updated consent form. And then you're going to click on finish. That's going to bring you back to the study page. So that was your process of uploading it. And then you want to say, that's all I had to do. I want to finalize my updates. You'll click on that. You're going to get this confirmation that you've updated the record and that it's been approved by the external IRB. And then to complete the activity, you'll click on OK. And then it's going to say updates complete, both here and here. It's also going to say update finalized in the history. And that's how you know that those revised documents have been pulled into Bruin IRB and will be passed on to Encore as part of the daily feed. And that's it. So that would be how you would keep your current version of your protocol and consent updated. And you wouldn't submit to us unless it met one of our required amendment submissions. So for me, that's all I have to present to you. I know it's a lot. We've tried to incorporate many of the questions we received during this first few weeks of implementation. But I'd like to open the floor now for questions. And I see some stuff in the chat, Gerard, that can help you.
Yeah, Vic has a question. Can you go over the difference between commercial, central, single, and external IRBs?
Sure. So all those are external IRB. So an external IRB is any institution or private IRB that is not UCLA. Okay, so an IRB needs to meet regulatory requirements in terms of membership and composition and their responsibilities, and they all meet the regulatory requirements. So external IRB is anyone outside of UCLA. We use the term commercial IRB to refer to for-profit IRBs. So we would say commercial versus academic IRBs. So these are companies that do what we do, and they follow the same regulations. Many of them are also accredited by AHRP, and they can serve as IRB of record for any institution that would like them to do so and has an agreement in place with them. Single IRB or SIRB is a term that's specific to the revised rule and the NIH mandate for single IRB review for all federally funded clinical trials. And that's a term that came up as a result of the Cures Act and the directive that we need to simplify the process for reviewing and activating clinical trials. So basically, a multi-site study is a study where a master protocol will be followed at multiple sites, at more than one site. And each of the clinical centers that are participating are performing the same procedures. So what we're doing at UCLA is happening at Stanford, it's happening at San Diego, and we're all enrolling subjects the same way, and they're all being handled according to the protocol-approved schedule of activities.
Okay, one more. Is Bruin IRB linked to Encore? And if so, do they still upload documents into Encore, or are they automatically uploaded?
So if you use the activity update study details, it will pass over to Encore as part of the nightly update that happens, just like it does in Web IRB. So for Reliance studies in Bruin IRB, the process will work the same. Now, some of you who have used Reliance or have some reliance on an external IRB before this change was implemented, you had to do that manually. So you had to update Encore manually and upload those manually. You don't have to do that any longer, but you have to use that update study details in order for that feed to go. Any other questions?
That's it for now, I think.
All right. We have 24 minutes.
I just wanted to clarify on that last question. So you said it will work similar to the current process through Web IRB. So I know like 24 hours, we go into Encore and there's like a IRB review on entry where then we physically upload the protocol and the ICF. So it'll be a similar process. We still have to go in there and physically upload those documents into that IRB entry in Encore.
I believe so. I believe the feed is the same. You would have to accept it into Encore. If it is that a safety net built in? I'm not familiar with that.
Okay, I just want to make
part
sure
of
that the
Encore.
documents aren't, because before the documents weren't being automatically fed over into Encore, there was still a manual component that we had to upload. So I think we just want to make sure that that hasn't changed, that we still have to go in
we
there.
haven't changed. We have not changed the basic setup for the feed. So
Okay,
however it's working in Encore now, it'll work that same way with Bruin IRB.
got it. Thank you.
Any other questions?
And since
No.
continuing reviews are no longer, you'll require PI assurances, but there won't be any actual CR submission. So when we are relying on external IRB, we would just follow their deviation and AE reporting criteria.
Their continuing review amendment AE reporting criteria, and you'll see with the commercial IRBs, they are very much to the letter of the regulations. So they're looking for submissions of unanticipated problems involving risk to subjects or others, so that they're unexpected, related, and have the potential for increasing risk of harm to participants or others. Serious and continuing noncompliance is the same definition that we would follow here. So, but you want to look at their website. They have their policies and procedures posted. They have submission instructions to know exactly what you would submit there. And then you would only come back to UCLA if you submit something and they say, yes, we need to suspend your research. We're terminating approval, you know, or we've determined this is a UPERSO or serious noncompliance or continuing noncompliance. So when you receive that, that will be the first question we'll ask you on a PAR submission here, is whether that determination's been made, or if the deviation has to do with not following HIPAA requirements. So you didn't get authorization, or somebody didn't sign the authorization form. You would have to report that in all instances because we are the privacy board.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So how do you become a PI proxy? Basically, your PI has to log into Bruin IRB and assign you as PI proxy. It's their decision, and it allows you to submit and items on their behalf. So it's basically, it's how your PI chooses to delegate responsibilities on the team. There's no requirements, but obviously you would have to be a study team member first. And to be a study team member, you'd have to be trained in human subjects protection principles and all the responsibilities. And the PI would have to provide assurance that whatever they're delegating you to do, that you have appropriate training, expertise, and in some cases, licensure. And so licensure comes into question with consent processes and things like that, that you would have licensure to perform the duties and explain the risk, to perform the procedures and explain the risk of those procedures. Any other questions? Now,
I'm so sorry. I want to follow up on my question for the PI proxy, because with Web IRB, I can very easily become PI proxy, but I've tried it before with Dr. Jakaki with Bruin, excuse me, IRB, and there were some hiccups. So I wonder, are the requirements like different between the two?
Yeah, I think in that case, that particular case where you had issues, you hadn't been added as a member of the study team yet, or the co-investigator that she was trying to make PI proxy hadn't been added as a member of study team. So you have to be a listed member of the study team before you can be assigned as PI proxy. So in that case, she had not yet added that co-I.
Got it. Okay.
And then all study team personnel should still be maintained through Bruin IRB, correct?
That's right. Right. And any updates to that come through Bruin IRB. But again, to simplify that process, again, we're taking to heart this mandate that we need to do things more efficiently. We've expanded the edit study personnel that was announced in the last Human Research News. So now you can update co-investigators, even those delegated to obtain consent. And we've revised the PI assurances so that this PI in making those administrative updates is ensuring that anyone she's delegating responsibilities to has appropriate expertise, training, and when applicable, licensure to perform the duties that they're delegated. So that is another benefit that you should, even with personnel amendments, the only time you should have to submit a reliance amendment would be a change in PI or faculty sponsor. Let's see. I don't know who Greg and Bernie are and those closeout activities, but
that was an internal question. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. And then let's see. Since we didn't require registration for this session, we won't have a sign-in sheet. But maybe Gerard, can you try and take a screenshot of the participants and we can send a list over?
Yep.
So again, subject enrollment information, I don't know if that's an internal question, but in terms of we are not requiring continuing reviews for Reliance submissions. So that is definitely something we're not requiring. You will be reporting that to the IRB of record. So everything that we're not doing at UCLA any longer, that's what Advara, WCG, Sterling, they'll be responsible to collecting that from you. So you may receive, so IRB Reliance at research.ucla.edu is copied on every notice you receive from the IRB of record. And so you may receive a message from one of our team members saying, oh, I see this is the second request for continuing review information from Advara. Please be reminded that your acknowledgement of reliance requires that you adhere to Advara's continuing review requirements and provide the necessary information. So we still monitor that you're maintaining active approval, but you're not submitting to us. So we may tickle you to say like, hey, you can't ignore them. You need to give them the information they're requesting. Any other questions?
There's a question about the consent process checklist. Should those be removed in the UCLA specific site form?
If it's approved by that by the reviewing IRB with that checklist in place, then it should be maintained. Again, we should only be making edits that correspond with the UCLA checklist for Reliance ICFs. So we shouldn't be adding new language in there, and we shouldn't be taking anything out that's been approved unless it has to be removed, like the subject injury language. So if there are,
There was one
Norma?
more. Is the limit for peer proxy still 2 people?
I don't believe there's a limit in Bruin IRB, but I haven't
Okay.
tested that. So just before we head off, I do want to encourage everyone on the call to please subscribe to OHRP Human Research News. And the way you do that, you go to our OHRPP webpage, the homepage, and all our updates are linked there. And if you click on those, it'll ask you, do you want to register for Human Research News? Any updates, new user guides, new videos, anything for that, we announce in Human Research News, and it's a great resource that Moore and her team put together. We are also updating FAQs as we get these questions in. We'll shortly be doing a few updates to address the question about sponsors not wanting to use an outside IRB, and also the question about studies that were withdrawn due to non-responsive correspondence. So our intent is to update those FAQs and keep them current and incorporate questions that we're receiving. We will have weekly office hours in February. Today we'll have one at 4 o'clock. That's specific to Reliance and Reliance submissions. So we look forward to seeing people there. And then again, we'll be repeating the training sessions with Advara and WCG in February. And those are the dates and times. And there's links in the FAQs to allow you to register for those sessions. And of course, if there's any email you need to remember regarding Reliance, it's irbreliance@research.ucla.edu. That will make it to the appropriate person and will get you the help you need or to address your question. And as always, I'm really grateful for your support as we implement this new procedure. And if you have any questions, concerns, suggestions, send them my way. I enjoy hearing from you, and we're here to make this as easy as possible and to really facilitate the activations of these studies for you and your PIs. So with that, we have nothing else. I think there's something in the chat. And yes, the recording of this presentation will be posted to our new library and will be available to you. Okay, I will give you back 12 minutes of your day, and stay dry and be safe out there. And thank you.